Hello everyone, this is Eric Egan, and in this video I'm going to be going over the points that I outlined on my modeling breakdown page and kind of showing a more in-depth look at some of the issues that I ran into and how to avoid them in the future. So what we have right here, this is one of the first models, or at least the first attempts at modeling that I did for General Grievous. And the thing is, the first couple of weeks I considered the outline phase, and I think that it's really important to create an outline of your character, no matter how rough it may be, because when you're dealing with subject matter um, that's new to you. So for me, obviously, I've never made General Grievous before. I don't know exactly how all of his forms move, maybe how the edge flow should be for various pieces. So the rough outline phase is very important for kind of it's essentially the testing phase for trying out new ideas and seeing how all the pieces fit together. So you can kind of see with this initial phase there are already a lot of differences between how the final product turned out. For one, the edge flow has changed a lot for quite a lot of the pieces. So, for example, here you can see there's quite a big pull there, which was later removed. Um, in general, the smoothing for these, let me just turn on smoothing, was not super good. You can see there's some pretty noticeable creases in a couple of areas. But with the first week, I'm kind of getting used to how this very unique form of his chest plate moves. Um, and so it's kind of a learning process, and that's why you gotta kind of rough stuff out at first. Of course, his collar guard here, I would later realize that it'd probably be a good idea to attach the bottom to it to have that be a smooth transition. And of course, his fangs, for the longest time, I just had them sitting to the side, but when checking the references, they are kind of resting on the front. Um, and so this outline phase it's just an important step. And if you get too far into the modeling, and for say I get done with this chest plate and I'm like, all right, that's finalized. When you start off with a rough base, like a super rough base like this, and just stick with that throughout the project, you're probably just going to have to end up redoing it at some point. Um, so it's better to just consider that the outline phase instead of just try to outright get the perfect form immediately. Because the lessons I learned from the rough outline phase made making these shapes for real a lot easier. Now, for my second point, my advice when you're working on your character is to always work in quads and aim for good edge flow. So this is, let's see, this is version 43, and this is a mostly finalized model with some areas that need some work. Um, there's some places that need a proper edge flow, and a couple of areas that, as we can see, are creating n-gons. Now, if you're doing a project that requires no animation, just still images, you might be able to get away with some n-gons. N-gons are shapes or polygons with 5 or more sides. You might be able to get away with those in some instances if you're not animating things, but as soon as you have light reflecting on those uh, those those polygons, it's going to behave super weird as soon as you start smoothing it. In this particular example, it's not a huge deal. It's still something that you want to go in and fix, which I do later. Um, but for example, you would probably want to move those across to create a loop there, and then you would want to terminate these edges either up here, maybe in the middle, so that probably here, just so you have a long edge to terminate it on. Um, but basically, you want to maintain quads as much as you can. Sometimes you have to go. Sometimes you have to settle with triangles in some instances, which you want to avoid, but sometimes they're unavoidable. Um, so try to maintain quads, and it will make the smoothing process a whole lot easier once you get to that part. Because trying to smooth a bunch of n-gons is not going to have the result that you want. Now, for my third point, my advice is to break down your form, and this is a pretty simple point, but basically it means when you start creating those final components for all of your pieces, keep in mind what the best primitive to start out with is. So, for example, with something like the chest plate, with its kind of boxy look to it, you probably want to start with a box to create something like that. And with more tubular shapes like this, you'd either want to start with a tube or a cylinder. And with shapes like this, kind of those are obviously just spheres. But for shapes like this that are very spherical in nature, even this one right here, you would want to start with a sphere. So just break down your shapes into their base form, and I can't really think of any examples, but if you really can't figure out exactly what primitive to use because it's so complex, or it just doesn't have a super identifiable primitive that that looks similar to it, um, then you'd probably just start with a box. Um, that would be the best way to approach that. Or for some organic forms, like for example the mask had a very unique approach to it, where the mask. So for example, the mask has a lot of very fine details to it, and so what I really wanted to do with so for the mask in particular, what I did was I did plane modeling. So I just took a flat plane and just started slowly inching that around, creating loops around the eyes, and just creating geometry slowly over time. Um, for like really boxy parts and very simple forms, that's probably that's probably too much work. I wouldn't. So for this, I would not create little planes and just slowly inch those around. I'll just create a cylinder primitive, mirror it, and then make sure everything's welded. So just know how to approach every new shape that you come upon, and just figure out the best method to accomplish the form that you're looking for. Now, for my last point, my advice is to uh, always make sure your models are optimized for smoothing. Um, a mistake that I commonly see um, people make is that when especially if you're trying to get something realistic, um, because if you want something realistic, you have to realize that no matter how sharp an edge may seem, there's always a little bit of curve to it. No, nothing in real life is completely sharp on the edges. So you always have to keep in mind um, how your object is going to look smoothed. So, so for example, with this collar guard, you have a crease here. And so if we were to look into wireframe, it's a little hard to see since this is a version that has been pushed down to an editable mesh, but it's a little bit easier to see here actually with the tube openings in his collar guard. What I've done is I've created loops. I've created a loop around this opening, and I have little loops on the edges here. And during the smoothing process, what this does is it tells the smoothing algorithm how tight each of these these edges are. Basically, how sharp they're going to be. Um, so the closer your supporting edges are, your edge loops are, the tighter your the sharper your edge will be. Um, so knowing how to effectively create those edge loops is one of the things that will help push your model even further and make sure the smoothing looks good. Um, so, for example, here, and the thing is, sometimes you can get away with using the Swift Loop tool for getting those edge loops in, but sometimes with a shape this complex, you really need to go in with the cut tool and just create those loops yourself. So for example, with this complex shape, you see you're going to need a loop going all the way around there, just to support this edge here. You're going to need to have a loop going all the way around there, all the way there, then up, down, up, and then a loop all the way back around. And the edge loop tool, or the Swift loop tool, is not going to be able to accomplish something that complex. So for those instances, you definitely need to go in with the cut tool. And what happens is if you don't do that, if you don't add that important supporting edge on one of the sides, it when you're texturing, it's gonna stretch a lot on that edge that isn't supported, and you might be able to get away with that with a base texture or a simple one, but with a more complex texture, it'll really be obvious how stretched it is, particularly on that edge. So very important to keep smoothing in mind when you're working on your modeling.